Masechet Shevuot, Daf Lamed Het. Shevuot Pikadon Kesad, Ten li Pikadon sheyesh li beyadecha vechule. The Gemara is going to discuss this section of the Mishnah that has a three-way machloket. Here is the case. We have to get this machloket straight because we're going to be analyzing this part of the Mishnah and bringing a parallel baraita. So let's get all the three opinions straight here. It's talking about a case of someone, there's 5 claimants against a person, Chamisha Tovim, and they each say, you have a deposit that we gave you, each one of them, 5 different deposits, give it back to us. And the defendant says, Shevuot she'en lachem biyadi. He says in plural, a vow, I don't have anything of yours in plural. In that case, is liable only to one korban, because he only said one Shevuot. Although he included 5 people in it by saying lachem, that's a general oath, only one vow. Shevuah she'en lecha biyadi, velo lecha, chayav al kol achat ve'achat. However, if he says a vow that I don't have anything of yours in my hands, talking to person claimant A, and not you claimant B, and not you claimant C, and D and E, and he says that to each one of them, then that's considered 5 vows. Although he only said the word Shevuah once at the beginning, we apply it to each one of the velo lecha. It's as if he said Shevuah she'en lecha biyadi to you, and also Shevuah v'gam lo lecha. By specifying each person, it's the same as saying 5 separate vows, and therefore he's liable to 5 different counts. That's Tanakh Kama, who's anonymous. We're going to assume right now that Tanakh Kama, who's anonymous, is Rabbi Meir. So that's the opinion of Rabbi Meir. Then Rabbi Eliezer comes and says, Al shiomar Shevuah ba'acharona. You have to say the word Shevuah after, both at the beginning and at the end, like bookends. Otherwise, if you only say at the beginning, maybe Shevuah only applies to the first person, biyadi, period. And then velo lecha is just saying, I don't have yours, but the vow might not apply to the second, third, fourth, and fifth person, so you only have to bring one, but he says Shevuah at the end, then everybody in between has a separate Shevuah, and he's liable to 5. Rabbi Shimon says, no, he's the most lenient for the defendant, and says he has to say the word Shevuah for each and every one. He has to say a separate sentence, Shevuah she'en lecha biyadi. Then turns to Mr. B, Shevuah she'en lecha biyadi. Okay. Those are the cases, and these are the cases of 5 different claimants. Then it goes on and gives a similar law regarding 5 different types of claims. It's a case of one claimant that goes to the defendant and says, give me back my deposit, pledge, stolen item, lost item, all these 4 different types of claim. And so we say a similar law there. If the Shevuah is all about one, I don't owe anything to you, then he's liable only to one. But if he specifies each one, then he's liable for each and everything that he specifies. And then we give a third example where it's a different type of item that he owes, wheat, barley, and spelt. And there we learn the same principle. If he says, I don't owe you anything, only liable to one. But if he says, I make an oath, I don't owe you, I don't have in my possession any of your, and he specifies wheat, barley, or spelt, and he's lying about all 3, then he will have to bring 3 different korbanot. And then finally, we do have Rabbi Meir named here. He says, even if you say in the singular, chita, seora, kusemet, even though he said singular, it doesn't mean only 1 grain of barley. He means wheat as in the entire species of wheat. So even though it's only in singular, still it's the same as saying in plural. Okay, that's the section of the Mishnah that we're going to analyze. So here we go. Tenor banan, kalal, eno chayav ela achat. Parat chayav al kol achat ve'achat divrei Rabbi Meir. So the baraita starts with a general type of statement. If you said a generality, the defendant said, I don't owe any of you, or it puts them all together, then, and he's lying about all 5, he's liable only 1. But if he specifies each person, then he's liable for each and every one. Okay, so everybody would kind of agree with this Rabbi Meir's general formulation. So we're going to have to see exactly what Rabbi Meir means by comparing him, contrasting him with the next opinion. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Shevuah lo lecha, ve'lo lecha, ve'lo lecha, chayav al kol achat ve'achat. Now the Mishnah didn't have Rabbi Yehuda, so this is a new opinion that we only know from this baraita. Rabbi Yehuda says, if the defendant says an oath that I don't owe you and you, and you, then he is liable for each and every one. The key here is the vav, because he's adding a vav in between each one. So the vav is considered a separation, and it's not considered all one all together, but rather the Shevuah separately applies to A, and then he says and B, so it applies separately to B and separately to C, and all 5 people, therefore he's liable to all of them. But Rabbi doesn't say this explicitly, but we can infer that if he left out the vav, Shevuah lo lecha, lo lecha, lo lecha, without a vav, then that would be the same as saying lechem, and he'd be including all of them. That would be a kelal. Okay, now Rabbi Yehuda is evidently arguing against Rabbi Meir. So what would Rabbi Meir say about these cases? That's what the Gemara is going to discuss when it analyzes Braita in just a minute. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, lo lecha velo lecha velo lecha shevuah chayav al kol achat ve'achat. Rabbi Eliezer says, if he says lo lecha and includes it and not to you, and also not to you, then he is liable for each and every one. Rabbi Shimon Omer ad shiomar shevuah lechol achat ve'achat. Rabbi Shimon says only if he says shevuah for each one. So Rabbi Eliezer said, as in the Mishnah, that he has to have the word shevuah at the end. You have to have it at the beginning and at the end. If you have that, then all the ones in between, we apply shevuah separately, and you're liable for each one. But if you don't have a Shevuah at the end, then, according to Rabbi Eliezer, it wouldn't matter if you had a Vav or didn't have a Vav. The Shevuah is only in the beginning. It applies only to one and not the rest of it. Whereas, according to Rabbi Shimon, each one has to have his own Shevuah. So Rabbi Shimon is the most lenient on the defendant. He'll have to bring a separate korban only if he says Shevuah each and every time. Rabbi Eliezer is a little bit more stringent, and so on up the line. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shemuel. That was the end of the Braita, and now Shemuel has one interpretation. Rabbi Yochanan says he's going to have a different interpretation of Rabbi Meir, and Rabbi Shemuel says, Kilalo shel Rabbi Meir, perato shel Rabbi Yehuda. Kilalo shel Rabbi Yehuda, perato shel Rabbi Meir. Basically, Shemuel is saying that Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda say the exact opposite of each other. That which is considered a general, including everybody altogether, for Rabbi Meir is the specific one in which one is liable to 5 for Rabbi Yehuda. And the one that's general for Rabbi Yehuda, where you'd be liable only 1, is the specific where you'd be liable to 5, according to Rabbi Meir. So, let's go back here and see. According to Rabbi Yehuda, if you have a Vav, then you're liable to 5 of them. But because the Vav is separating each one separately. But if you don't have a Vav, then that's the same as putting them all together, because there's no Vav in between, and therefore you'd be liable only to 1. Rabbi Yehuda is disagreeing with Rabbi Meir. So Rabbi Meir must think the opposite. Both ways, according to Shemuel. If he has a Vav, so Rabbi Meir would say the Vav is linking them all together and putting them all as one. So it's liable only to 1. Whereas, if he leaves out the Vav and says lo lecha, period, then each lo lecha is considered a separate statement, and the Shevuah will apply to the first one separately, the second one separately. You have to bring 5 oaths. So that's exactly the opposite of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says, with a Vav, there is liable to 5. Without a Vav, liable to 1. Rabbi Meir, this is all in the interpretation of Shemuel. According to Rabbi Meir, if you have a Vav, then that's all 1. Whereas if you don't have a Vav, then you're liable to 5. Okay, now Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Hakol modim be'lo lecha shu perat. According to Rabbi Yochanan, everyone agrees. Rabbi Yehuda says this explicitly, and Rabbi Meir also agrees that if you have a Vav, the Vav is separating each one into 5 different liabilities. Lo nechliku ela be'lo lecha, she'Rabbi Meir omer perat, ve'Rabbi Yehuda omer kelal. Rather, the machloket is only in one case when he has no Vav. There, Rabbi Meir says, no Vav, that's separating them out. So according to Rabbi Meir, within Rabbi Yochanan, it doesn't matter if you have a Vav or don't have a Vav, each one is a separate statement. You didn't say lachem, I don't know any of you. It doesn't matter if you said with a Vav or without a Vav, you're specifying lecha, lo lecha, or ve lo lecha, ve lo lecha. that's considered separate statements, 5 different counts. Whereas according to the Yehuda, if you don't have a vav, then we put them all together because the vav is not separating and you're only liable to one. Now we ask, according to the Yochanan, since both of these cases are considered perat, what would be the case of kelal where you're liable only to one according to the Meir with the Yochanan? And his answer is Shevuot she'en lachem biyadi. Only if he says a plural, I vow that I have nothing of yours, all of yours in my hand. So then that's one vow because he didn't specify each one of them at all. What is at the root of their machloket? Shemuel daik me baraita, Rabbi Yochanan daik me matnitin. Shemuel is focusing on and inferring from the baraita that we just learned, whereas Rabbi Yochanan is focusing on and inferring his view based on the Mishnah that we learned also earlier today. Shemuel dayik mi baraita, mideka amar Rabbi Yehuda, velo lecha perata have, mikelal de shma'eh le Rabbi Meir, damar kelala have, v'amar le Rabbi Yehuda perata have. Shemuel is reading the baraita as much as possible and inferring that from the fact that Rabbi Yehuda says the case of velo lecha with a vav, and that is considered 5 separate counts. So it must be that he heard Rabbi Meir talk about that very case, and he heard Rabbi Meir say that with a vav is all considered together. And Rabbi Yehuda is responding to Rabbi Meir saying, says, no, I disagree. In other words, what Rabbi Meir says is a kind of general statement, so we can't really tell in the Braita what Rabbi Meir said. But from the fact that Rabbi Yehuda said, I disagree about this vav with a vav, that means that with a vav, that's what he's responding to. Rabbi Meir said, with a vav is considered all one. Rabbi Yochanan amar tarvaihu le Rabbi Meir perata have, ve'amar le Rabbi Yehuda be ve'lo lecha moden alach, be'lo lecha paligna alach. Rabbi Yochanan says, I can explain also the baraita. The reading does not quite as smooth, but he could explain it. And he can say that according to the Rabbi Meir, whether you have a vav or don't have a vav, it's considered separate statements, 5 different vows. And then the Yehuda says, listen, regarding with a vav, that I agree. That's what he actually said in the Braita. And then the parts that's not in the Braita, but that we can infer that what he said, if he says, I agree with this, then that means he doesn't agree. In the other case, where there's no vav, there I disagree with you. Shmuel tells Rabbi Yochanan, that doesn't make sense. Rabbi Yehuda should say what he disagrees about, right? Instead of saying, I agree with you about this, okay, that's not the most interesting thing to say. Right? You could, Rabbi Yehuda, naturally, if Rabbi Meir said, here's what I think, Rabbi Yehuda should say, I disagree regarding the case of whatever he disagrees about. So it doesn't make sense to say that he's only saying what he agrees about and leaving out what he disagrees about. And therefore Shemuel says that's not a natural reading of the Baraita. Shemuel would rather say he is specifying exactly what he disagrees about, which is the case with a vav. Okay, so we see that Shemuel is a more natural reading of the Baraita, although Rabbi Yochanan could fit in his opinion if we needed to. Rabbi Yochanan dayek mi matnitin. But Rabbi Yochanan, he's going to have a smoother reading of the Mishnah. Midekama Rabbi Meir, Shevuot she'en lachem biyadi, kelala have, mikelal de velo lecha perata have. Disa kadatech velo lecha kelala hava, ad mashma lan, Shevuot she'en lachem biyadi, nashme'inan Shevuot lo lecha velo lecha velo lecha. Kol sheken Shevuot she'en lachem biyadi. So Rabbi Yochanan learns from the Mishnah where Rabbi Meir is Tanakama, which is Stam, but we're assuming it's Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yochanan generally has this rule that Stam Mishnah is Rabbi Meir. So since what's the example of a klal in the Mishnah? Shevuot, make a vow that I don't have anything of yours, plural. And so we can see that since he uses that example as the klal, then if he says ve lo lecha, even with a vav, then that would be not the case. It would be that would be separate, 5 separate counts. Because if you think which what Shemuel thought, that ve'lo lecha is a kalal according to Rabbi Meir, that's all together as one, then why would the Mishnah bother telling us the case of she'en lachem, the plural, that there it's one? The Mishnah should teach us a bigger chidush, that even if he says lo lecha ve'lo lecha, then there's only one count, and all the more so if he would say lachem, that would only be one count. So Rabbi Yochanan says a simple reading of the Mishnah proves my point. Now, what Shemuel going to do with the Mishnah? Shemuel Amar, Kol Hamer ve'lo lecha, Ke'omer shevuah eshen lachem biyadi dameh. Shemuel says the Mishnah is effectively saying the same thing. It doesn't exactly say this, kind of summarizing. If you say ve'lo lecha, that will be the same as saying lachem. So the Mishnah doesn't specify it, but it may as well. It's like all included within Lachem. It's all the same. All right, it's a much more difficult reading of the Mishnah, but that's the point that we said before. Rabbi Yochanan has a smoother reading of the Mishnah. You could fit in Shemuel to the Mishnah, but it's difficult. And Rabbi Shemuel has an easier reading of the Baraita. Rabbi Yochanan will have a harder time. Tenan, lo lecha ve'lo lecha ve'lo lecha. Teneh lo lecha. Now, a challenge to Shemuel. Shemuel, how could you say that according to Rabbi Meir? Let's look at the Mishnah once more to make it clear. So in the Mishnah, when again we're assuming Tanakama is Rabbi Meir, it says the example of Perat is ve lo lecha, ve lo lecha. It has a vav and says he's liable to 5. So this part of the Mishnah seems to definitely prove Rabbi Yochanan's opinion. How could Shemuel explain this? And his answer is amend the Mishnah, take out the vav in that case. Okay, well, that's an easy answer if you wanted to take out the vav. Okay, Tashema, tenli pikadon utzomet yad vegazel va'abeda. Now we're going to bring an example from the continuation of the Mishnah, and here it's again anonymous, so we're going to assume that this next case is also to be Meir, and if you notice, it says pikadon utzomet yad vegazel va'abeda. It has a vav between each one, and let's assume that's to be Meir, and he says that that's considered separate. So that proves Rabbi Yochanan and goes against Shemuel. So Shemuel will answer, Teneh tzumet yad gezel abeda. Take out the vav in each of them, and then it reads according to Shemuel. All right, convenient answer. Tashema, ten lichitin usorin vechusmin. Okay, in the next case, about different items, it says also with a vav, and this is against Stam, so that's to be Meir. And it says if you have a vav when he denies wheat, and barley, and spelt, then that's considered separate oaths. So this proves Rabbi Yochanan's reading. Challenge to Shemuel, Teneh seorim kusmin. Shemuel has an answer. Take out the vav here also, and then it will prove Shemuel. Now, this is too much. V'hai tana kol hachi shabish taneh ve'azil. This tana, meaning this author, this memorizer, is he making so many mistakes and continuing? It's understandable. Maybe he could make one mistake in one clause. It's possible. He didn't realize and he said it, he taught it that way. But he made the same mistake again and again, 3 times. It doesn't matter. We can't handle. One small emendation, maybe, but so many emendations we cannot accept. Rather, a new answer to the previous questions for Shemuel. Shemuel could say that the anonymous Mishnah here is not Rabbi Meir, but rather Rabbi Yehuda Nasi himself. He is the editor of the Mishnah, and sometimes he gives his own opinion. Sometimes anonymous is Rabbi Meir, it's true, but sometimes it's Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. Not Rabbi Meir. Damar, lo shena kezayit, vela shena kezayit kezayit, perata haveh. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, in a different context, says, it doesn't matter whether you say kezayit without a vav, or kezayit kezayit. Either way, they're considered separate statements. This is said in the context of if someone brings a korban, a kohen, brings a korban, having in mind, when he does one of the avodot, that it's going to be consumed after the time. If he does that, it's pigul. If he has in mind, it's going to be after the place, in the wrong place that it cannot be eaten in, then it's pasul. It's not pigul, but it's pasul. Now, what if he says both? He says it's going to be consumed in the wrong place and also in the wrong time. Well, since he said in the wrong place first, so it's already pasul. Once it's pasul, it's not going to be pigul. He actually saved himself from pigul. Now, is there a difference if he says kezayit outside the place, kezayit outside the time, or if he says an and in between, according to the B, it doesn't matter whether he says and or not. It's considered two separate statements, and therefore it will not end up being pigul. Okay, anyway, because the B says that it makes no difference if it's a vav or not a vav over there, we apply that also over here. That statements with a vav or without a vav are considered separate statements, and that's the opinion that says over here with a vav. But indeed, the B Meir, who was explicitly mentioned in the Baraita, that could be as Shemuel's reading, and that way Shemuel doesn't have to explain the Mishnah, because the Mishnah is the B, and Shemuel instead is following the Baraita, where the natural reading of the Baraita is according to Shemuel. Tashema midideh Rabbi Meir omer afilu chita us'ora vechusemet chayav al kol achat ve'achat teneh chita us'ora kusemet. Okay, now another challenge against Shemuel from the last statement in the Mishnah, where it specifies Rabbi Meir precisely, and Rabbi Meir says even if he says chita, wheat in singular, and barley and spelt, and he has a vav over here, and this is surely Rabbi Meir, not Rabbi, because it says Rabbi Meir. So, and yet he's liable to all three. So teneh here we'll make an emendation and take out the vav. Okay, so we could make an emendation even if we say the rest of it of the anonymous is Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. We're still for Shemuel going to have to make one emendation, but we can live with one emendation, not three emendations. My afilu. Now let's just explain this statement. What does it mean when he says afilu, even if he says this formula? Amar Ravacha bered Rav Ika afilu chita bichlal chitin usora bichlal seorin vechusemet bichlal kusmin. Rabbi Meir is teaching us that even if he says singular wheat, I have no wheat. He doesn't mean to say I don't have one grain of wheat that in your hand. Well, then he might mean just one specific grain. That one I don't have, but I do have others that I stole from you. No, he doesn't mean that. Rather, but the singular means the entire species. I don't have any wheat. And so it makes no difference if he says plural or singular, he means no wheat. And if he does have any wheat, then he'd be lying and he'd have to bring a korban for each one of the things that he lies about. Now we go back to the Mishnah. Ten li pikadon utzomet yad gazel va'abeda sheyesh li biyadecha vechule. So the rest of the case is about someone claiming many things, and then he vows about one thing, one korban. If he specifies all the things in the vow, then it'd be many things. So regarding this case of ten li chitin useorin, someone says, "Give me back my wheat, barley, and spelt," and then he says, "I make a vow. I do not have anything in my possession of yours, not wheat, not barley, not spelt." Now the law of Shevuot Pikadon is that one is liable to bring a korban only if the amount that he has stolen in his hand is at least a peruta or more. Now, what if he has less than a peruta? I'll say 1 grain. 1 grain is worth less than a peruta. He has 1 or 2 grains of wheat, 1 grain of barley, 1 grain of spelt. Each one by themselves is less than a peruta. But let's say you put them all together, and then it will be worth a peruta. This is Rabbi Yochanan's chidush, that you put them all together, and you count them all together, and then he has to bring a korban. Peligi barav achav ravina. Chadamar aperate michayev akelale la mechayev. V'chadamar akelale nami mechayev. Now we're going to see a machloket that will have an effect on how you understand Rabbi Yochanan. There's a machloket between Rav Acha and Ravina. One of them says that when one makes a vow, one is liable for each of the specifics, but not about the generality. In other words, if I say, I don't owe you anything, that's a generality. Not wheat, not barley, not spelt. That's the 3 specifics. So let's say I actually do have all 3 of them in my possession. According to the first opinion, I'm liable only to 3 korbanot for the specifics. For the oath as a whole, I'm not liable. But the other opinion says I actually be liable to 4 korbanot. 1 for the entire oath altogether, and then an additional 1 for each of the things that I specify. Now, this will have an effect on how we understand the Rabbi Yochanan, because if you say I'm not liable to the general oath but only to the specifics, then Rabbi Yochanan, when he says you add them all together, well, it cannot be talking about this case of the specifics. Rabbi Yochanan, we don't know exactly which part of the Mishnah Rabbi Yochanan is talking about. So according to the first opinion here, Rabbi Yochanan, who says you put them all together, that would only be in a case where I say a general vow, I don't owe you anything, right, of anything. Then putting them all together because they're all one vow, then you'd count them all, add them up, and see if they're worth a peruta. But according to this first opinion, if you said I don't owe you wheat, barley, spelt separately, and I have less than a peruta of each because the 3 korbanot are only on the 3 specific things, and each one is less than peruta, then I would not be liable at all. That's the first opinion. Second opinion that says I'm liable for the generality also and actually have to bring 4 korbanot. So if there was less than a peruta of each one separately, then I would still have to bring 1 korban, even in the case when I specify them. Because I have to bring of those 4 korbanot, one of them is for the general vow, and then 3 more would be for the specifics. So the specifics also I wouldn't have to bring if it's less than peruta each, but for the generality I would have to bring. So Rabbi Yochanan's rule will apply to one part of the Mishnah or another, depending on which of these 2 opinions you say. Now let's analyze these further. How could you say that you should count also the generality? After all, there's a braita where Rabbi Chia said, if let's say 5 people claimed each one wheat, barley, and spelt, then, and he actually has wheat, barley, and spelt from all 5 of them, so he's lying about all the vows, then he has to bring 15 korbanot. That makes sense. 15, 5 times 3. 5 different claimants, each one claiming 3 things. But you see here, it's times 3, not times 4. Now, if you would say that you're liable for the klal in addition to the pirat, then it should be 5 times 4 will be 20. So this is a challenge to that opinion. And the answer is, Hay Tana defrate kachashib, techla la kachashib. No, this Tana of Rabbi, that Rabbi Chia is quoting, when he's calculating, he was only including the korbanot that you'd have to bring for the specific oaths. Although, yes, you'd have to bring more korbanot for the general oath of each one, of each of the 5. But he wasn't counting them because he was interested in showing you that the more people times the individual oaths, and so indeed it would be 20, he just wasn't counting them. Okay. Wait a second, there's another baraita that Rabbi Chia teaches where he says that it is 20. So this would be a challenge to the other opinion that says there's no generality. If it's 5 people, and each one is making 3 claims, then it should be 15. Why does it say 20? So this would be a challenge to that opinion. And the answer is, pikadon utzomet yad vegazel va'abeda. No, this baraita wasn't talking about a case of the wheat, barley, and spelt, but rather when each of the 5 people claim 4 things: deposit, pledge, stolen item, and lost item. So that's why there's 4 piratim times 5 people. That's where you get to 20. So we can explain that baraita that way. ואמרו לו, תן לנו פיקדון, תשומת יד, וגזל ועבדה שיש לנו בידך. אמר אל אחד מהן, שבועה שאין לך בידי פיקדון, ותשומת יד, גזל ועבדה. ולא לך, ולא לך, ולא לך, ולא לך. מהו? Okay, question, a similar case that we just had, where there's 5 different claimants, and each one is claiming 4 different things. So 5 claimants, and each one said, give us all these 4 things that you owe us. And he made a vow to one of them. I make a vow that I don't have in my hands and he specifies the 4 things. And then he says, and also you, and also you, and also you. Now, how do we put that together? Mahu ahada michayev. Is he liable, let's say, for the other 4 claimants, and he actually has in his hands all those things? Do we count the velo lecha as a one general, including all 4 of the items that he stole? So you don't have to bring 1 korban for all those people each. In other words, he'll have to bring 4 korbanot for Mr. A, because he specified for him. But then he'd only have to bring 4 more, 1 each for the other people, 8 altogether. Is that it? Or Dilma akol chada v'chada mechayev. Or when he says velo lecha, is that actually multiplying and saying, and velo lecha also all those four things I specified, I am as if specifying them also for you, Mr. B, and for you, Mr. C. So the velo lecha actually multiplies everything that came before, and therefore he'd be liable to 4 times 5, 20 korbanot. So that's the question. Tashema de Tanir Bichia Harekan Esrim Hataot. Well, we have the Braita. We just quoted it. That one's liable to 20. So that's the answer. Hechi Dameh. Now the Braita is very short, so we don't know exactly what the case is. But let's try to figure it out. Ide Parish. Rabbi Chia minyana atalash mo'inan elalav de la parish ushma'mina peratahave. If he specified for Mr. A, he said all 4 things. Mr. B actually said all 4 things, and C all 4 things. Well, then obviously he'd be liable to 20. He specified 20 different things. Rather, it must be that he did not specify for Mr. B and C and so on. And we can learn from here that even though he just said and also velo lecha, that's considered the same as multiplying the specifics, and he'd be liable to all 20. Anasta ufitita et biti vechule. Now the next case of the Mishnah is a claimant comes and says, you raped or you seduced my daughter, therefore you have to pay me. And there was a machloket about that case when the person says, no, I didn't do it. The father says, I administer an oath to you. The defendant says, Amen, I agree with that oath. So according to the Bishimon, he does not have to bring a korban because it's a fine. One has to pay a fine to the father of the victim, and since a fine, one could admit it and wouldn't have to pay. So too, when he denies it, he does not have to bring a korban. That's Rabbi Shimon. But the rabbis say he does have to bring korban because he's still going to be liable to pay for humiliation, degradation, boshet, pagam. And those are monetary amounts, not a fine, but damages. And so those he would have to pay no matter what. And therefore, since he denied doing the crime, by denying doing the crime, he's denying that he owes the money for humiliation, degradation, which we'd have to pay whether he admitted or not. So he's bringing korban for that. Let's analyze this machloket. Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba Amar Rabbi Yochanan. My tamad Rabbi Shimon ho'il ve'ikar kenas hu tobeya. So Rabbi Yochanan says, what's the reasoning of Rabbi Shimon? He explains, because the main claim, the primary claim, is about the fine. And the other damages, that's on the side. But the main thing is coming, I claim, I want you to pay the fine. So we focus on that. Amar Rava, Mashal de Rabbi Shimon lemad davar domeh. L'adam she'amar lechavero ten li chitin usorin vechusmin sheyesh li biyadecha. Amar lo sheboah she'en lecha biyadi chitin. Rava says, I'll give you a parable to understand Rabbi Shimon's position better. If a claimant came and said, I want you to pay me the wheat, the barley, and spelt that you have in my possession, give it back to me. And he says, I make a vow that I don't have wheat. He only makes the vow about the wheat. It turns out, now, what he vowed about the wheat, he actually doesn't have. So he was telling the truth. But he does have sorin and chusmin, but he didn't make a vow about that, so therefore he's not going to be liable to bring any korban. When he made a vow about wheat, that part was true. That's the same thing here, where the claimant says, you owe me, you owe me for the fine and also for the boshet and the pegam. But when he says a vow, in his mind, he's thinking that the vow should only apply to the fine. That's the main claim, and he's not really thinking about the other ones. And therefore, since he's not liable to the fine, because that's the general rule, you're not liable to shvata pikadon for a fine, so he doesn't pay that. And the other two, his vow didn't apply to them because that's not the main part of the claim. Abaye says, no, your mashal doesn't match the reality. In the mashal that you brought, he denied wheat, but sorin and kusmin he did not deny in the vow, so of course he's not going to be liable. But here, by saying it wasn't me, I didn't do it, he's denying all 3 of the payments. So he should be liable for the 2 payments that are damages and they're not a fine. Abaye says, I'll give you what the mashal that it's really like. It's like someone who claims, pay me the wheat, barley, and spelt that you have, that's mine. Shewa she'en lecha biyadi kelal. And the other one says, I have nothing of yours. Vishtekachitin hu deletle haseurin v'chusmin itle d'mechayav. And it turns out it's true. He doesn't have any chitin of the claimants, so he's not liable for that. But he does have barley and spelt, so he'd be liable for those two items that he denied. And so that's the parallel here, that the claimant said, you raped my daughter, you owe me three things. And then he says, no, I didn't do it. By saying I didn't do it, okay, we understand for the fine part, there he would not be liable because it's a fine, and if he admits it, he wouldn't have to pay. But for the other two, he is liable. So this would support the opinion of the rabbis. Ela ki ata Ravin amar Rabbi Yochanan l'divrei Rabban Shimon kenas hu tobeya velo boshet ufagam. L'divrei Chachamim af boshet ufagam hu tobeya. When Rabin came from Eretz Yisrael, he reported the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, I'll give you a better understanding of Rabban Shimon, of Rabbi Shimon. And he says, kenas, when the claimant is claiming the fine only, and actually the claimant is not even bothering to ask for boshet upgam. That's according to Rabbi Shimon. According to Chachamim, the claimant the father does want to collect also boshet and pagam in addition to the fine. Now, why would that be? What's the reasoning behind it? Amar Papa, Rabbi Shimon Sabar, La Shavak Inish Midi de Kis, Vetaba Midi de la Kis. According to Rabbi Shimon, generally a person's psychology is that he is not going to set aside something that's a fixed value, a fine is a fixed value, and go and try to claim something that's not a fixed value. The boshet and pagam, there you're going to have to get an assessment. How much was the degradation? He's going to say this is worth that much. And he's going to say not that much. And he's going to have to go get a third party to assess how much it's worth. So that is too complicated. A person, when he makes a claim, would rather make a simple claim so that he can get paid more easily and say, here, you committed rape, you committed seduction, you owe this fixed amount as a fine. And that's the main thing that he wants to get. And he's going to set aside and not even claim the other things which are dependent on an assessment and not a fixed value. And therefore, he never made the claim at all regarding the boshet and pegam. So, since the claim is only on the fine and making a vow about a fine does not prompt a korban, that's the reasoning of Rabbi Shimon. V'Rabbanan sabre, la shabik midi dechi modei be la miftar, v'tava midi dechi modei be miftar. Rabbanan actually would have the opposite reasoning. A claimant, is not going to leave aside something that if the defendant would admit, then he would not still have to pay, and claim only something that if the defendant would admit, he wouldn't have to pay. In other words, the fine is actually the one that's more wishy-washy, more difficult to collect, because if the defendant would admit, then he wouldn't pay the fine. So the claimant, the father, is going to say, I'm not going to just collect the fine. If I go and ask for the fine, he'll just admit, I'll walk away with nothing. No way. I'm not going to leave aside the boshet and pegam. That he has to pay no matter what, even if he admits. So yeah, I'm going to go through the trouble of getting an assessment and making sure to collect that also. So since that, according to Rabbanan, that's the general psychology of the claimant. So all three are included in the claim, and therefore, when he denies that he didn't do it, he's denying a monetary payment, and that's why he is liable according to Chachamim. Hazran alach Shevuot HaPikadon. We now begin the sixth perek, Shevuot HaDayanin, הטענה שתי כסף, וההודעה בשווה פירוטה, ואם אין ההודעה מן הטענה, פטור. This perek is talking about the Shevuah of Modeh B'Miksat. If someone comes and claims, you owe me $100, and the defendant says, I owe you 50 only, but denies the other 50, then the court administers a vow that indeed he owes only 50 and not the full 100. So this is what's talking about Shevuot HaDayanin. There are, of course, other types of vows that the court will administer, but we're only talking about Modeh B'Miksat right now. The idea is that if I say you owe me 100 and you say no, I owe you 0 and I have no proof, then you don't have to make a vow because who am I to claim? I need proof. But if I say 100, you admit 50, so already you're admitting that there's something going on here, and we're afraid that maybe the reason why you're saying 50 and not 100 is because you have 50, and you intend to pay the 100 later on, but you're buying time. And so by admitting by admitting part of it, it doesn't have to be 50, a 10, a 90, then you're already saying, yeah, I do owe you something. So then it's suspect. Okay, probably there could be, not probably, but could be that there's something else going on here, and you're just buying time, and so therefore the judges administer an oath. Now, there are certain limitations on when this oath is administered, and here's some of them. Ta'ana, the claim has to be for at least 2 silver ma'ah. If the claim is for less than that, then there's no vow. And the admission has to be for at least a peruta. If he says, oh, I owe you half a peruta, that's not even an admission, because it has to be something substantive, something that's an actual value. And if the admission is not of the same type as what the claim was, I don't owe you that, I owe you something else, then in all these cases, patur. We're going to give examples. Kesad. Sheteh chesef li biyadecha, en lecha biyadi ela peruta, patur. Sheteh chesef ufruta li biyadecha, en lecha biyadi ela peruta, hayav. On tomorrow's daf, we're going to see there's 2 different interpretations of this part, but let's take a simple one. So how so? If the claimant says, you owe me 2 silver ma'ah, and the other person says, no, I only owe you a peruta, then he's not liable, because the part that he's denying has to be at least 2 kesef, and here he's denying 2 kesef less a peruta, because he's admitting 1 peruta, and so therefore the claim is not sufficient. But if the claim is, you owe me 2 kesef plus a peruta that you have in my hands, I want you to pay me, and the defendant says, no, I only owe you a peruta, so he is admitting a peruta but denying a full 2 kesef, so that is liable. If someone says, you have 100 dinar, I want you to pay me, and the defendant says 0, then there's no vow. It's talking about where I don't have any proof, that I don't have witnesses or a document. So we just throw out the case. But if I claim, I said, you owe me 100 dinar, and then you say, no, I only owe you 50, that's the exact case of modeh b'miksat. If a claimant says, my father gave you 100 dinar and you owe it to him back. You owed my father. Now he died, and so now you have to pay me the 100. And the defendant says, no, I only owe 50. In that case, he is not liable, because the vow of modeh miksat is only if the claimant himself, it's owed to the claimant himself, and not if he inherited the claim from his father. The reason is because a son doesn't always know exactly all the business dealings of his father, and therefore we would not make the claimant pay if the claimant says, no, I don't know anything, and the son has no proof about it. He just heard about it, so he's not going to have to pay anything. And since he doesn't have to pay anything, if he decides to pay some of it, that's like returning a lost item. It's something that he would not have expected to get back, and he's giving it back. So if he gives back 50, good. Now the claimant got 50, but otherwise he might have gotten nothing. He didn't have any proof, and so we generally think that the son doesn't know all the things of the father, and so the claimant says, no, it was not true, I paid back already. The defendant says, it's not true, I paid back already. So then he doesn't have to give a vow for modeh b'miksat. Modeh b'miksat vow is only if the claimant is the original person to whom the money was owed. Maneh li biyadecha, amar lo hen, lemachar amar lo tenehu li, netativ lecha, patur. If a claimant says, give me 100 dinar that you owe me, he says, you owe me 100 dinar, and the defendant says, yes, indeed I do, but he doesn't pay him at that point. The next day comes back and says, okay, now give it to me, and the defendant says, I gave it to you already. he's exempt because maybe he gave it during the night, overnight. So it could be that he's telling the truth, and he's denying the entire amount. So there's no vow. En lecha biyadi chayav. But if the same case, and the defendant says, I have nothing of yours in my hand. There was never such a thing. I never owed you. In that case, he's liable because yesterday he admitted that he owes 100. The claimant said, you owe me 100. The defendant says, yes, I do. Comes back the next day, okay, can you pay me the 100? He says, no, I don't know what he's talking about. I never owed you 100. He already admitted. So then he has to pay. Now, a variation of that case, if the claimant says, you have 100 that you owe me, and the defendant says, yes, indeed, I agree to that. And then the claimant says, I want you to pay me only in front of witnesses. I don't want you to come and say, I paid you already, and then there's no witnesses, and then I'm not going to have a claim. So you have to pay me in front of witnesses. Lemachar amar lo tenehuli netativ lecha chayav mipnei shesarich liteno be'adim. In that case, on the next day, if the claimant comes and says, now I want you to pay me, and the defendant says, I already gave it to you, the defendant has to pay because the claimant said, I want you to pay me with witnesses. And can the defendant produce witnesses that he paid? He can't. So therefore, he did not live up to the terms of the agreement and he has to pay. Litra zahav yesh li biyadecha en lecha biyadi ela litra kesef patur. If someone, the claimant says, you have a liter, a weight. This is a weight measurement of gold in your possession. That's mine. I want you to give it to me. And the defendant says, no, I don't have any gold, but I do have a liter of silver, a certain weight. It's not coins, but a certain amount of silver, then he is not liable because even though he's admitting to something, the something that he's admitting to is not of the same type as what the claim was. The claim was for gold, and he says, I have no gold. So it's a complete denial. Then he happens to admit, I owe you silver, but that's not included within the claim. However, if it's about a monetary amount of a coin, then that would be included. Dinar zahav yesh li beyadecha. If someone claims and says, you owe me a golden dinar, so that's a currency, happens to be made out of gold. And he says, en lecha biyadi ela dinar kesef, utresit, ufundiot, ufruta, chayav, shakol min matbeya achat. If the defendant says, no, I don't owe you a dinar zahav, I only owe you a dinar kesef, which is less. Or he says, any of these other types, other coins, then he's liable because they are all part of the same currency system. And so it doesn't matter if one's made out of gold or silver or bronze, since they're all about the monetary value, so then the smaller is included within the bigger. That's different if he says a weight of gold and a weight of silver. That would be like asking for one type of item and then admitting a different type of item, which is the next case. The claimant says, you owe me a quart of grain. And the defendant says, no, I only owe you half a quart, and not of grain, but of legumes. Well, legumes is not included within grains, so he's denying all the grains, and therefore he does not have to make a vow. Kor perot li biyadecha. If the claimant said, you owe me a quart of fruit, and the defendant says, no, only a small amount, letech, of legumes, then he is liable because legumes are included in the general word of perot, whereas legumes are not included in grain. If the claimant says, you owe me wheat, and the defendant says, I don't owe you any wheat, but I do owe you barley, then that's considered two separate items. One's not included in the other, and therefore he would not be liable. However, Rabban Gamliel says one is liable. Now, Rabban Gamliel certainly is talking about the last case, so it seems that Rabban Gamliel disagrees with the principle that the admission has to be of the same type, and therefore it seems that Rabban Gamliel disagrees not only with the last case, but with all the previous cases, as long as he's admitting something that's of value, even if it's a different item, he is still liable. The claimant said, you owe me this many jugs of oil. And the defendant said, I only owe you the jugs, but not any of the oil. So I've just empty jugs. That's what I owe you. Admon said, well, that is included. The one thing that he admitted is included within the claim, because the claim was about jugs with oil. He admitted to the jugs but not the oil, so that's modeh b'miksat, and the defendant has to make a vow that he doesn't owe the oil. Chachamim omrim en hahoda'a mimina ta'ana. Chachamim say no. Well, this is not called that the admission is within the claim. The claim was really for the oil. The jugs are totally secondary to the oil. The oil is expensive. The jug is a cheap clay jug that's just there to carry the oil, but the jug is not itself. The claim was really about the oil, and therefore the fact that he admitted, I only owe you clay jugs, that's not considered the included within the claim, and he does not have to make a vow. That's Chachamim. Amar Rabban Gamliel, Rabban Gamliel says, I agree with Admon, and that's for sure true because Rabban Gamliel says even if it's wheat and barley, one has to make a vow, which is two different things. So certainly Rabban Gamliel would say in this case that he has to make a vow because the claim was technically for kadeh shemen, so this was included at least nominally in the claim. Ta'ano kelim v'karkaot v'hoda b'kelim v'kafar b'karkaot v'kafar b'kelim patur. There is a rule that modeh b'miksat only applies to movable objects, not to land. If I say, you owe me 2 acres of land, and you say, no, only 1 acre of land, there's no modeh b'miksat regarding land. And so now variations on that. If the claim was regarding vessels and land, and he admitted to all of the vessels, but denied all of the land, or he admitted to all of the land, but denied all of the vessels, he is not liable because when it comes to land, that doesn't count at all. And regarding the vessels, in one case, either he agreed to also pay for everything, or he denied everything. So there's no modeh b'miksat. Hodeh b'miksat ha'karkaot patur. If I asked for a lot of land and you admitted to only some of the land, again, no vow, because modeh b'miksat does not apply to land. B'miksat kelim chayav. But if I claimed, let's say it could be vessels, let's say vessels and land, I said this much land and 100 vessels, and you agreed to some of the vessels, then you're going to have to make a vow. And in that case, once you make a vow regarding the vessels, you will have to make a vow also regarding the land. Even though if I only asked for land and you admitted part of the land, you would not pay. But now, since I asked for land and vessels, and you admitted to part of the vessels, so the property for which there is no guarantee, meaning the movable items, that's the kelim that prompts a vow. Once you're making a vow, that will bring together and require a vow also for the property for which you can have a guarantee, meaning that you can use as a guarantee, and that is referring to the land. One does not have to take an oath for a claim of someone who's deaf or insane or a minor. Since they don't have da'at, their claim is not considered a valid claim, so they will not trigger a vow on the part of the defendant. And one cannot force, one cannot administer an oath to a minor. Someone makes a claim against a minor, he's a minor, so we're not going to make him take a vow. However, we do make a vow if we want to collect money from a minor or from Hekdesh, special protection, even though we don't usually require a claimant to make a vow, but in the case when you want to collect money from a minor or from Hekdesh, the one making the claim has to make a vow in order to collect. Now the Gemara asks, Hechi mashbe'inan le. How do we administer this oath? Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, mashbe'in oto b'shbo'ah hamura b'torah dichtiv, v'ashbi'acha b'Adonai Elohei hashamayim. Rav says, we administer the oath as it is said in the Torah, where Abraham tells his servant, he makes him swear that he's going to go and find a wife for Yitzchak from, not from Eretz Canaan, and he says, I will make you swear by Hashem, Elokeh, the God of the heavens. Amar le Ravina Rav Ashi, Kiman, Kerebi Chanina bar Idi, Damar ba'inan Shem HaMiyuchad. Now, in that vow that Abraham made, number one, he uses Hashem's name, Yud Ke Vav Ke. But in addition, he has the servant put his hand on the place at or near his circumcision. So there's a number of elements that Abraham did. So when we say that the court administers the oath in the same way that it says in the Torah regarding Abraham, what aspect is it talking about? So Ravina asked Rav Ashi, who is this following? Does this prove, Rav over here, does it prove the opinion of Rabbi Chanina bar Idi, who says that in order for a vow to be valid, you have to use Yud Ke Vav Ke, Shem HaMeyuchad, the special name of Hashem, and not one of the kinuyim. Amale afilu tema rabbanan damre bikinui v'nafka minas harich latpuseh chefsa bideh. Rav Ashi says no. You can even explain Rav's opinion according to Rabbanan, who say that a vow is valid even if you use one of the other names of Hashem. So in that case, what is Rav teaching? Oh, he's teaching that you have to hold something holy, just like Abraham had the servant hold on to the place of circumcision, which is holy, so too the person making the oath has to hold on to something holy like a Sefer Torah. And this last statement of Rav Ashi would be in accordance with Rava, because Rava says that if a judge administers an oath and has the oath taker say Hashem's name, but that's it, and does not hold a holy item, then it's invalid, and this would be a mistake regarding a tradition. If a judge makes a mistake regarding a tradition, then the verdict is thrown out. If he makes a mistake regarding shikul hadat, something that you can reason this way or not, then it stands, and the mistake he has to pay out of his pocket. But if it's a devar mishnah, something that is a basic tradition, then everybody should know, then it's considered a false verdict, and we throw it out and we judge the case again. So there's such a big mistake if he doesn't use an item, a holy item. And so Rava and Rav Ashi is following the opinion of Rava here, supported by it. V'amar Rav Papa, Haydayana dashpa betifilin nasa kemi sheta'a b'dvar mishnah v'chozer. Rav Papa says that if a judge uses tefillin as the holy object, that's not good enough. You have to use a Sefer Torah, and this is such a bad mistake that we throw out the verdict altogether. It's simply a mistake in a Mishnah. Halacha does follow Rava that you have to hold a holy item. But halacha does not follow Rav Papa that it has to be a Sefer Torah, even if it's only tefillin, that's sufficient. And we explain the halacha is like Rava, that if you don't hold anything at all, it's no good, because you have to hold a special item. But the halacha is not like Rav Papa, because as long as you're holding something, even if it's only tefillin, that's sufficient. It doesn't have to be a Torah scroll. Shevuot mu'umad, tamid chacham meyushav. A couple of more laws, that a Shevuot vow has to be taken standing up. But if the person taking the vow is a tamid chacham, then out of respect, he can sit down while making the vow. Shevuot b'sefer Torah, tamid chacham l'chatechila b'tefillin. A vow ideally should be with a Sefer Torah. It doesn't have to be. We said halacha is not like Rava. Rava said it has to be. So we don't say I think it has to be, but ideally better to use a Sefer Torah, because that's much more holy, much more scary for a person to lie while holding a Sefer Torah. However, if the person is a Tamid Chacham, then out of respect we say it's okay to wear tefillin. We trust you. It's easier, and we don't require a Sefer Torah for a Tamid Chacham. Baruch Adonai leolam. Amen ve'amen.